They laughed in my face, called me dead weight, said I wouldn't last a mile before washing out. Name's Claire Donovan, 22, recruit sand scorching my knees. Gulls screaming overhead, fingers clutching the dog tag my father left me. Funny how quick a crowd forgets. So tell me, what would you have done if the strongest man went down? They laughed when Claire dropped to her knees in the hot sand, already convinced she was finished before the drill had even begun. The sound of it carried across the training field, sharper than the gulls that wheeled over the shoreline. The run had just begun, and already the other recruits had made their judgment. From their perspective, she looked like the kind of person who would fold early the weak link in a line of hard-charging bodies. For Claire Donovan, the sting of the laughter was not as sharp as the sting of the sand against her palms. She pushed her fingers into the gritty surface, caught the briny smell of the surf rolling in, and tasted salt, both from the ocean and from her own sweat. She had dropped to her knees not because she lacked the will to keep going, but because her pack had shifted awkwardly and cut across her ribs. Still, to them, the picture was enough a girl too small for the load. Ethan Morales was the loudest voice. He had the easy swagger of a man who had once been cheered on Friday nights under stadium lights, the kind who still carried the echo of crowds in his stride. He pointed toward her with a grin that spread wide across his tanned face, and his laugh rolled through the line like permission for others to join. Knew she wouldn't last. He called his voice almost gleeful. The recruits around him chuckled, some nervously, some because they wanted to stand on the safe side of ridicule. It was easier to laugh than to be mistaken for the one being laughed at. Not everyone joined. Sarah Whitman stood near the middle of the group, her small notebook tucked into a waterproof pouch at her side. While others jeered, she pressed her lips into a line and scribbled quickly, recording the moment as though it mattered beyond the sting of now. Her father's words often returned to her in such moments. A soldier is measured by heart, not height. She didn't look at Claire with contempt. She looked with curiosity, waiting to see what the quiet Nebraskan girl would do next. Chief Barnes observed in silence, his arms crossed his lined face, unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. He did not bark at the recruits to stop, nor did he step in to rescue Claire from their sneers. Years of experience had taught him that recruits revealed themselves best when left to the pressure of their peers. His eyes gray as the morning mist lingered on her longer than on the others. Then he blew the whistle again, not to stop the laughter, but to drive the run onward. Claire felt the burn in her calves as she pushed herself up. Sand clung to her knees, her hair stuck to her cheek, and her pack seemed heavier with every breath. She whispered to herself softly enough that only the surf might hear, "I'll finish." No one was meant to hear it, but Sarah, closest to her, caught the murmur and raised her eyes from her notes. There was no bravado in Claire's tone, only a quiet promise she seemed to make to herself. The recruits surged ahead. Boots pounded across the wet sand where the tide lapped low. The sun had not yet risen high, but already the day carried the promise of heat, of blisters and sweat. Ethan and his closest circle ran at the front shoulders, back arms, pumping with the confidence of those certain of their own superiority. The middle of the line jostled for position, each runner unwilling to be counted among the stragglers. Claire hung at the back, each stride smaller but determined, each breath measured. Across the road, the neon sign of a diner buzzed to life in the early hour, announcing hot coffee to anyone passing by. The scent drifted faintly, teasing the recruits with comfort just out of reach. Claire caught a whiff and thought of mornings at home, of her father's percolator hissing on the kitchen counter before the chores of the day began. That memory steadied her pulse more than the rhythm of her feet. The run stretched longer. Sand gave way to patches of gravel, then back again. Sweat dripped from brows, shirts clung to backs, and the Pacific air turned heavy. Several recruits glanced back at Claire, expecting to see her collapse again. They were met instead with the steady image of her small figure, still moving slower than most, but never pausing. Ethan scoffed when he noticed her shadow behind them. He whispered to the runner beside him loud enough to carry, "She'll be last if she even makes it." Sarah, pen in hand during a brief rest pause, made another quick notation, her expression thoughtful. She did not cheer or comfort, but she did not jeer either. She wanted to remember how it felt in this moment, the easy cruelty of the strong, the quiet resilience of the underestimated. Barnes waited at the checkpoint with his stopwatch. He watched as the leaders crossed, chest heaving, sweat dripping. They looked proud, even smug. Ethan crossed with a triumphant snort, pumping his fists as though a finish at training were a medal. Others followed, collapsing onto the sand, grateful for the end. Barnes clicked his stopwatch with each silent and stern. Minutes later, Claire approached. Her legs trembled. Her pack sagged, but her gaze remained fixed forward. She did not sprint the final yards. She did not lift her arms in showmanship. She simply placed one foot after the other until she crossed the line. Sand coated her knees from earlier, and sweat had darkened her shirt in uneven patches. She bent at the waist, hands on her thighs, catching her breath. The laughter had stopped. Only the waves and the gulls filled the pause. Barnes made a note on his clipboard, then spoke low enough for only those nearby to hear finishing counts. His words, brief and gruff, carried weight heavier than a cheer. Claire straightened slowly, acknowledging him with a nod, though she said nothing. Sarah closed her notebook with care, her eyes soft with a kind of respect that others had not yet found. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his earlier laughter echoing hollow in his own ears now that the target had not broken. He looked away as though distance might erase his mockery. The recruits drifted toward the board where the next day's schedule would be posted. Sweat still rolled down their faces, sand clung to their boots, but the curiosity about what lay ahead tugged them forward. A sheet was tacked up, edges fluttering in the sea breeze. Names were listed under drills and groups. Claire pushed through the cluster, her chest still rising and falling from the run. Her eyes scanned until she found her own. Next drill posted open water swim. Claire's name circled. The ocean was colder than their laughter, but she waded in anyway. Fog held to the shoreline like a low ceiling, muting color and sound. Recruits stood in a restless line, wetsuits, squeaking breath, ghosting white in the early chill. A whistle popped the hush, and they trotted toward the water packs, swapped for fins and masks. Claire adjusted her strap with steady hands. No speeches, no announcements. She took the cold the way she took long days on the plains, one breath at a time. Ethan planted himself where everyone could hear him. "Stay clear or you'll get run over," he joked, puffing up as if the sea were his home field. A few snickers traveled the line. It wasn't cruel so much as careless habit, more than thought. Claire kept her eyes on the gray chop, counting the sets, timing the swell that would meet her first strokes. Harris moved through the group with quiet authority, tall even with fins in hand. People made space without being told. He nodded once to the instructor, then to nobody in particular, and fixed his mask with the economy of someone who had done this 1,000 times. If Ethan was noise, Harris was signal. The first wave of swimmers hit the water and vanished into fog. Claire stepped in and felt the cold clamp her ankles, her knees, her ribs. Her breath wanted to spike. She wouldn't let it. In, out. She slid forward, arms cutting a narrow lane. The Pacific closed over her shoulders, and the world shrank to a drumbeat of breath and a ribbon of bubbles from the snorkel ahead. Ethan surged past, kicking hard, showy, and fast. He turned his head just enough to see if anyone noticed. Harris didn't look right or left. He was already a blur, his fins a metronome. Claire found a rhythm no one would applaud, small, reach-patient kick, steady as a clock. She let the cold sharpen her, not stop her. Markers floated beyond the break. The first leg was manageable, the second ran cross-current, and the last brought them back through chop and shore pull. Claire rounded the first buoy arms, settling into a cadence that wasted nothing. She could sense bodies near her splashes, the odd cough, a flash of neoprene. The fog worked in her favor. She couldn't see how far ahead the others were, and it didn't matter. Halfway through, the current pushed hard to starboard. A few swimmers drifted wide and had to correct. Claire angled early, counting beats to hold her line. When her shoulder brushed the second buoy, she allowed herself one thought still in it. Her calves prickled, then numbed. The cold had become a fact, not an argument. On the last leg, wavelets slapped her cheek and tried to steal her breath. She shortened the stroke and kept the kick light breathing on the high side as she'd practiced in quiet pools far from any ocean. Someone thrashed past, then fell away. Another swimmer's elbow clipped her forearm. She folded, slipped beneath, and rose again without a splash. The beach was only a suggestion. In the fog-darker sand, a smear of figures a stopwatch held at shoulder height. She hit the shallows and stood too fast, wobbling as pins and needles screamed back into her legs. Sand sucked at her fins. She powered through, pulled them off, and jogged the last yards on numb feet. The instructor called times, voice flat professional. Claire heard her number and nothing else. She was inside the limit barely, but inside. Ethan, already toweling off, threw a grin that didn't quite land. Harris drifted in with that same unruffled pace, hardly winded. They strung towels over a rail and stood under a strip of pale sun that had broken the fog. Conversation loosened. Nobody mentioned the cold. Nobody mentioned the way Claire had managed the cross-current like she'd been born to it. Sarah came up quiet, a pencil tucked behind her ear. "You keep your stroke like a metronome," she said, not a compliment so much as a fact. Claire nodded once. "Waste less that way." By late morning, the shore had shed its gray, and the diner's neon clicked warmly, promising heat in a mug. The recruits clattered inside wet boots, leaving sandy half-moons on the floor. Vinyl booths squeaked in welcome. A jukebox near the door rolled out harmonies from the Beach Boys, and a few heads bobbed in time, unembarrassed. Mrs. Callahan poured coffee as if it were a kind of mercy sturdy wrists and an easy smile that reached her eyes. Ethan slid into a booth with two friends and raised his voice for the room. Some folks just survived by the skin of their teeth. He didn't look at Claire, which meant he did. One of the others laughed because it was expected. Sarah's eyes narrowed, more disappointed than angry. Claire took a seat at the counter where the chrome edge gleamed, and the laminate had been wiped so often it was soft. The tip jar beside the register held a small drift of singles and change, a handwritten sign taped to the glass. "Thank you for your kindness." Mrs. Callahan set a heavy mug in front of her, steam curling toward the fluorescent lights. "First cup's always the best," she said, then leaned in a fraction. "Quiet ones get it done." The words were gentle, not secret, and they rested like a hand on a shoulder. Claire wrapped her fingers around the mug and let the heat sink bone deep. Harris came in late, moving carefully, not because he was tired, but because he carried a kind of steadiness you didn't rush. He nodded at Mrs. Callahan, who filled a mug without asking, then took the end seat and folded into the small noises of people pleased to be warm. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't need it. If he noticed Claire at the counter, he said nothing, and the nothing was respectful. Ethan's story gathered details. It hadn't earned how the current had been stronger than usual, how he'd powered through like a machine. He tossed a glance over his shoulder toward the counter, as if to underline the difference between brag and fact. Sarah slid into the stool beside Claire. "They'll time us again," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with careful clinks against the mug. "You plan to change anything?" Claire shook her head. "Breath and line." Mrs. Callahan set a plate down, eggs over easy toast cut on the diagonal. "On the house," she said, and when Claire started to protest, she waved it off. "Eat. Cold takes more than folks think." The jukebox clicked to another sunny chorus about surf and cars. The kind of song older folks mouthed along to without thinking. A veteran in a faded cap sat 2 stools down, reading the paper, and tapping a toe, the bill of his hat shadowing eyes that had seen more seas than any of them. The room smelled of coffee and butter, and the faint salt they'd carried in with them. When the plates were clean and the mugs half empty, the talk shifted to the board back at base. Somebody said the new roster would go up by noon. Harris finished his coffee and stood leaving bills under the saucer with the plain habit of a man who never forgot the tip. He touched the brim of his cup toward Mrs. Callahan in thanks and gave the recruits a small, companionable nod before he left. Claire watched the door swing and felt no need to follow. The day would be long enough. Outside, the sun pressed down a different kind of cold, leaving their bones. They walked back in small clusters, laughter quieter now, the easy cruelty blunted by fatigue and something else they couldn't name. At the board paper edges fluttered in a sea breeze that had finally found its warmth. Names stood in clean rows, fresh ink crisp against white. Roster shows combat dive simulation. Claire and Harris in same group. They thought she was finished until the strongest man collapsed. July 3rd dawned with a glare that promised no mercy. The sky was a hard blue, the kind that made shadows sharp and heat unforgiving. By mid-morning, the sand along the shoreline burned underfoot. Recruits lined up under the weight of the day, squinting against the light, their shoulders already slick with sweat. Today's drill meant hauling weighted dummies through the surf and across the sand, another test, another chance for pride or humiliation. Claire adjusted her harness with the same quiet care she gave to everything. Her arms felt tired from the previous days, her body still remembering the cold drag of the ocean. She bent to lift her dummy and staggered, knees dipping toward the sand. The laughter came quick, too quick, as if they had been waiting for her stumble. Ethan's voice rose above the rest, sharp with mock triumph. "Told you lightweights don't last long out here." The grins spread around him again, eager faces hungry to belong on the winning side of the joke. Sarah stood nearby, her notebook tucked in her vest, her eyes narrowing at the chorus. She didn't write this time. She only watched as if holding judgment for later. Chief Barnes remained stone-faced, his clipboard steady, his whistle catching the sun. He did not interrupt. Claire straightened, breath rough in her throat. She shifted her grip and pressed forward, the dummy dragging, leaving a trail through the sand. It was awkward, ungainly, but she did not stop. The line of recruits stretched across the beach, each hauling their burden. Some worked in rhythm, others cursed, and the surf ate the sound before throwing it back, jagged against their ears. Harris, tall and broad, carried his load with a smoothness that drew admiration. His movements were practiced, each stride confident, water streaming off the dummy across his shoulders. Even Ethan, mid-boast, glanced his way with grudging respect. Harris looked every bit the standard others measured themselves against. But the sun pressed harder, and the weight did not forgive. Claire focused on her breath, each inhale fighting against heat, each exhale steadying her rhythm. She was behind as usual, but moving. When a shadow shifted across the sand, she glanced up and saw Harris stumble. His step faltered once, then again. His grip loosened and the dummy slipped sideways. His arms tried to adjust, then his knees gave way. With a heavy crash, Harris went down, face pale sweat shining like oil. The recruits around him froze. Some gasped, some muttered, all unsure. Ethan, closest, hesitated. His eyes darted between Harris and the finish marker ahead. Seconds dragged while he weighed pride against duty, and his legs twitched as though ready to run forward instead of back. Barnes's whistle did not blow. The only sound was the surf pounding, the gulls crying, and the stunned stillness of young men and women caught between instinct and training. Claire did not wait. She dropped her own dummy where it fell and crossed the sand toward Harris. Her steps were awkward under the weight of her decision, but they did not falter. Kneeling, she checked his face, breath, shallow chest rising, but strained. Around her, no one moved. With a practiced grip that looked too precise for a novice, she rolled him, slid her arms, and with a burst of strength born from quiet resolve, she hoisted Harris across her shoulders. Sand stung her knees again as she steadied, but this time there was no laughter. The recruits watched in silence as the smallest among them carried the strongest. Her boots sank into the hot sand with every step. Each grain felt like fire, each breath tasted of salt. Harris's weight bore down heavy, pressing her spine, but her stride stayed even. Ethan's mouth worked soundlessly. His usual confidence cracked wide open. Sarah's eyes shining scribbled notes even as her hands trembled. Barnes's gaze tightened, not surprised but measuring something none of the others understood. She crossed the distance without theatrics, only grit. Sweat poured into her eyes. Her shirt plastered to her back, but she did not stumble. She carried Harris past the line where others had stopped through the waiting silence and across the mark where finish was counted. The air held still as though even the gulls were waiting. Sand shifted under her boots one last time and she lowered Harris into the arms of waiting corpsmen. His chest rose shallow but sure. The silence lingered thick and heavy. One of the corpsmen leaned toward Barnes, voice low but urgent. Then he turned to Claire, wiping sweat from his brow. "Harris wants to see you." Barnes muttered under his breath, almost to himself, his eyes never leaving Claire. She wasn't supposed to do that. The beach was quiet now, no jeers, no boasts, just the hush of waves and the weight of what she had done. Evening laid a gentler light over the shoreline, a rinse of gold softening the same sand that had burned all afternoon. The ambulance tracks were scuffed into oblivion by wind and tide, and the only sharp sound left was the slap of water against pilings. Claire stood at the edge of the med bay entry, salt still dried on her collar, listening to the low machines inside. The air smelled like antiseptic and ocean, a strange blend of clean and brine. She didn't reach for the door. She rested her palm on the cool metal bar and waited, the way she had learned to wait quietly without drawing attention. A corpsman stepped through the inner curtain. Green scrubs creased a line of fatigue under his eyes. "He's stable," he said, voice calm. Heat exhaustion and dehydration. Quick transport helped. He gave her a look that was not a smile but carried the same warmth. "You kept him moving." That mattered. Claire nodded once, small and sufficient. Relief loosened something between her shoulders. It wasn't joy so much as permission to breathe. Outside the base was winding down. A gull perched like a sentry on the lamp near the walkway. At the chapel across the lot, the bulletin board glass reflected the last of the light. Claire drifted that way, drawn by the quiet. Someone had already posted a flyer for tomorrow beach cleanup and community barbecue, a small flag printed in the corner, times typed beneath. Volunteers needed, it read. "Bring gloves if you have them." The word volunteers tugged at her in a way she couldn't have explained some steady, practical good work that didn't ask for glory. Boots scuffed behind her. Barnes came to a stop beside the bench, cap brim shadowing his eyes. He didn't look at the flyer first. He looked at her. For a breath, neither spoke. Then, in the same tone he used to call times and read rosters, he said, "You acted. You did right." It wasn't a speech. It was a measurement. He let it stand in the air between them, then added almost as an afterthought, "Next time, call it in sooner." "We'll tighten that." The correction lived easily with the praise, two sides of the same coin. Claire accepted both with a nod. Improvement was the point. Recognition came, if it came at all, only in passing. Sarah found them there, notebook tucked under her arm like a small book of hours. She had washed the sand from her face, though a pale stripe across her cheekbone showed where her goggles had bitten earlier. "I checked on him too," she said, almost apologizing for caring out loud. "They said he'd be fine after fluids and rest." She sat, opened the notebook on her knees, and smoothed the page with her palm. The pencil traveled in a neat line as she wrote without looking up. Strength is often silent. She underlined the words once, then twice, as if she wanted the line to hold. From the barracks far down the walk came the faint whir of fans fighting heat. Windows were propped with books and boots to coax a breeze, and voices carried in scraps half a joke. A low whistle, the murmur of names read off duty sheets. Ethan passed in the middle distance, shoulders squared but pace uneven. He glanced toward the medbay and then away like a man who hadn't yet learned how to say what needed saying. He did not approach. He did not jeer. Absence could be a kind of apology when words were not ready. "Form up," Barnes said later, voice cutting gently through the quiet. They gathered on the sand where the day had begun. The heat had bled from the ground. Even the gulls seemed subdued. Recruits stood in two uneven lines, salt stiff shirts, brushing eyes darting. Claire took her place at the end the way she always had and found that the space around her felt oddly wider, as if the line made room without being told. Barnes didn't hold a formation long. He was not a man for ceremony. "Today showed me what I needed to see," he began. "We measure a lot of things here, time, distance, heart rate. But the measure that matters is whether you put someone else ahead of yourself when the moment comes." He let the wind take that for a beat before he continued. "Donovan did that. That's the standard. No flourish, no applause, just the facts spoken plainly the way facts are when they're carved into a ledger you don't see but feel." The silence that followed wasn't the same silence that had cut after the collapse. This one was fuller, like a room where people were standing. A few recruits shifted off their heels. Sarah closed her notebook without writing the rest of the sentence she had started, as if the words had already been said for her. Ethan's jaw worked once, and then his shoulders sagged half an inch in something that could someday turn into humility. Dismissed, they broke apart in ones and twos. The sun finally slid behind the pier, and the base lights flicked on small halos in the dusk. Claire walked the long way back the route that carried her past the smell of cut grass and the vending machines that clicked and hummed along the corridor. In the barracks, fans rattled in the windows, stirring air that tasted faintly of laundry soap and salt. A pair of socks hung from a bunk post like flags surrendering to gravity. Someone had taped a photo of home above a pillow. Grandparents in lawn chairs, a dog grinning with its tongue out, a sky so wide it looked like a promise. She sat on her bunk and unlaced her boots, leaving a little constellation of sand on the floor. Across the aisle, Sarah dated the page and drew a small box around the underlined sentence. "He'll want to thank you," she said softly, not looking up from the paper. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need thanks. She needed the day to end and tomorrow to begin. A shadow filled the doorway, the hall lights making a borrowed halo around a familiar head. The corpsman cleared his throat in a polite way that didn't wake the ones already half asleep. He held a folded scrap in 2 fingers, the crisp edges catching light. His gaze found Claire without searching, as if the room itself pointed the way. Corpsman Harris asked to see Claire. His voice was rough, but his words were clear. "You carried me when no one else moved." Morning found the medbay flooded with a soft, forgiving light, blinds tilted so the sun drew pale ladders across the floor. Machines hummed with a steady confidence, and the smell of antiseptic had traded its sharpness for something almost clean and kind. Claire paused at the threshold and then stepped in boots, quiet on the waxed tile. Harris lay propped on pillows, an IV dripping at his shoulder color, back in his cheeks, but the kind of tired that sits deep. He managed a smile that wrinkled the corners of his eyes. It wasn't a hero thing, she said, unsure where to put her hands, finally curling them around the rail of his bed. "You needed to move. I was there." He chuckled a dry sound that didn't go far. "And you did it. That's the part I'm sticking with." He glanced at the open blinds. "They say I scared a few people. I don't like that much." "You scared the ocean," she said, and the small joke loosened them both. For a moment, the room was only light and breath, and the knowledge that a bad turn had bent back toward good. The corpsman checked numbers, nodded, and left them the dignity of quiet. Harris watched the doorway close and then looked up at Claire. "There's a thing tonight," he said. "Barbecue down on the beach. Folks will make more of it than I want, but not like a parade. Walk in with me, not to show off, to anchor the story in what actually happened." She hesitated. Crowds were not where she rested. "If it helps," she said, "if it keeps it honest." "That's exactly it." He pointed with his chin toward the light. "And sunshine helps a man tell the truth." When she stepped back outside, the day had shed its early chill. Flags along the walkway lifted and settled in a lazy breeze. The bass felt different on the fourth voices, looser faces open a little less hurry in the stride. Ethan waited near the rail hands working at the strap of his watch, eyes tracking a line on the concrete as if it might give him the word he needed. He looked up when she approached, and whatever speech he'd practiced fell all over itself. "I should have helped." He blurted the words clumsy and true. "I kept thinking about times and points and, well, I looked the wrong way. I judged the wrong thing. I'm sorry." She watched him fight his own pride and found nothing in herself that wanted to make him fight more. She held out her hand. His shoulders dropped a notch as he took it. The shake was brief but steady. "Try looking the right way next time," she said, and the advice held no sting. They walked toward the diner together, Sarah falling in beside them with a greeting that felt like a truce. Inside, the air was warm with coffee and butter and a curl of bacon on a flat top. Vinyl sighed under weight as they slid onto stools. The jukebox cycled something bright and easy harmonies that had been on the radio for as long as summer had been summer. Mrs. Callahan was already there with a pot in one hand and a towel over her shoulder. "Holiday refills are the best kind," she announced, topping off 3 mugs with a practiced tilt. She set plates in front of them, eggs over, easy for Claire, scrambled for Sarah, a mountain for Ethan that made him grin in spite of himself. Toast arrived with the corners crisped, just so, butter melting into shy gold puddles. The tip jar by the register wore its usual plea in block letters. "Thank you for your kindness." "My Joe served on a destroyer," Mrs. Callahan said, eyes going soft at a memory she clearly liked to take out and look at. Came home with a habit of saying less and meaning more. "Folks who've been through things don't waste words." She flicked a look toward Claire that was not nosy so much as knowing. "Eat up. The day is long." They ate like people who knew they'd earned it, quiet chewing over the jukebox and the chime of the door. Sarah stirred her coffee and said, "He asked you to walk in with him." Claire nodded. "He doesn't want ceremony." Ethan rubbed a thumb along the rim of his mug. "He wants it true," he said, testing the weight of that word as if it were new to him. At the end of the counter, a man in a faded veteran's cap folded his newspaper and left a tidy stack of bills under his saucer. He touched the brim toward Mrs. Callahan, who answered with a wink. On the wall, a corkboard held snapshots, kids with sparklers, a dog wearing a bandana, a younger Mrs. Callahan in front of the same counter with a cake frosted like a flag. Time in small squares held up with thumbtacks. Ethan slid some bills into the tip jar more than habit demanded. "My mom always said you pay for what you can't make at home," he offered, and Mrs. Callahan laughed. "Then you're paying for stories today," she said. "These take years." The door swung open and a shaft of sun found Harris's sister, who waved from the vestibule and gave a thumbs up toward Claire as if approval could be passed like a baton. Harris's voice carried from somewhere behind her, joking with the corpsman about hospital gowns and dignity. The light felt simple and good without the glare that had punished them yesterday. When the plates were cleared and the coffee warmed one last time, Claire stepped into the doorway and let the day settle over her. The base, the beach, the smell of charcoal already beginning somewhere downwind, it all folded into a sense that things might be solid tonight. Her phone buzzed with a short message from the Med Bay release planned for late afternoon. She looked up and found Harris crossing the lot with careful steps and a grin that made him look younger than the day had allowed. He stopped in the shade and kept it brief the way people do when the meaning is bigger than the words. "I'll walk in with you tonight, not for show, just truth." They didn't make arrangements beyond that. They didn't need to. She headed back toward the barracks through air that shimmered above the asphalt, past a row of bikes dressed in flags, past a kid waving a sparkler in the middle of the day, because patience is a skill that takes years. The fans were still rattling in the windows when she climbed the stairs. On the wall beside the door, the duty board weighted corners curled by heat names typed in strict columns. A fresh sheet was pinned on top. She ran her finger down until it stopped where it always did. Duty roster. Claire marked free for BBQ. No one remembered who had laughed, only who had carried. Evening rolled in, slow and wide, the horizon washed in purple light that softened into orange along the waterline. The beach smelled of smoke and salt grills snapping with corn on the cob burgers stacked on foil trays. Folding chairs sank slightly into the sand, their fabric patterned with stars or stripes, some so faded you could guess the years of picnics they had seen. Music drifted from a portable speaker oldies that settled into the air like a memory too familiar to name. Claire worked with a pair of kids near the tide line, handing out gloves too big for their hands. They gathered cans and stray wrappers, dropping them into bags with the serious intent children always brought to simple jobs. She bent with them, plucking seaweed tangled with a plastic ribbon, her smile small but certain. A sparkler hissed nearby, a child waving lines of light in the dusk, his parents reminding him to keep clear of the chairs. By the time she brushed sand from her knees, Harris was making his way down the beach, family in tow. His steps were slower than they had been a week ago, but steady, and the people with him formed a kind of protective circle. He broke from them when he saw Claire, his hand lifting in a wave. "This is her," he said to his family when they reached her. "This is who didn't walk away." His voice carried, not loudly, but with a resonance that drew nearby heads. His sister squeezed Claire's hand. His mother touched her arm. Gratitude, simple and unornamented. Sarah hovered close, notebook in hand, but closed for once, as though some things didn't need to be written to be remembered. Ethan was off to one side, unfolding chairs with a focus too deliberate to be casual. When his eyes met Claire's, he gave a nod, not dramatic, not apologetic, just respectful. It was enough. Mrs. Callahan appeared with a pie tin balanced in one hand and a smile as bright as the fireworks yet to come. "Apple cooled just right," she said, cutting a generous wedge onto a paper plate. She handed it to Claire with a wink. "The strong need sugar, too." Claire accepted the crust flaking warm under her fork, cinnamon drifting into the air like another kind of firework. Barnes stood at the edge of the gathering arms, folded the brim of his cap, hiding most of his face. He wasn't speaking, but he was seeing, and in that silence was the kind of recognition that lasted longer than clapping. When Harris leaned toward Claire, voice pitched for her alone, his words carried the weight of more than thanks. "I put a note in your file, just the truth." The promise in that sentence was not about reward, but about record, about how moments lived would echo in the places that measured such things. Barnes, overhearing without showing it, gave the smallest of nods. The night climbed higher, fireworks beginning in bursts of red and white and gold over the Pacific. Children gasped, veterans in faded VFW caps saluted with plastic cups raised, and couples leaned together in the sand. Claire stood slightly apart. Pie plate emptied the hush of the waves beneath the booms above. Barnes approached at last, his voice roughened by years but steady. "Rescue swimmer elective starts next month. Think about it." He didn't wait for her answer. He just tipped his chin toward the water, as if the ocean itself had a say in the matter. Claire's gaze followed the line of waves, black silver under the fireworks. The sky cracked and shimmered, but her eyes stayed on the horizon. The laughter of days past had burned away in the flare of rockets and salt air. What remained was quieter, stronger, something she could carry. The night closed not with fireworks alone, but with the quiet recognition that kindness had spoken louder than pride. Claire's simple act of caring another when others hesitated became the memory that outlasted the laughter. It reminds us that compassion often wears no uniform, and that strength is measured not in appearances, but in the willingness to step forward when it matters most. Like a lantern in a window on a dark road, such kindness guides more than the one it touches. And perhaps tomorrow, we might each offer some small light of our own,